Good afternoon, and thank you for joining Ada for this webinar on family violence in recovery. This is Ada's first Recovery Matters webinar for 2021. My name is Amanda Leck, and I'm the Executive Director at the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, and I'm delighted to be your host today. I wish to start by acknowledging that I'm hosting this event from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all join us from today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connection to the lands and waters across Australia. I will introduce our speakers shortly, but before I do, I would like to provide you with some brief housekeeping notes. Today's event will be recorded and made available after the event. Today we will be using the Q&A feature on Zoom to take questions, so please post your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat window. You will be able to upvote questions by clicking the thumbs up button, and I will do my best to ask a number of these to our speakers following the presentation. I encourage you to use the chat window to share any thoughts or reflections during the presentations, and just a reminder that you will need to select all panellists and attendees in the drop-down menu for everyone attending today to view your messages. I would like to remind you to please be respectful to each other and our presenters when posting your comments or questions. Please join me in welcoming our speakers for today. Dr. Deborah Parkinson is the manager of the Gender and Disaster Pod. Deborah is a researcher for Women's Health in the North and Women's Health Goulburn Northeast and Adjunct Research Fellow at Monash University. Her work over the past decade has focused on gendered experience of disasters. In 2015, Deborah was awarded the Social and Political Sciences Graduate Research Thesis Award for her PhD on domestic violence after the Black Saturday bushfires. The same year, the Gender and Disaster Pod was established by WHGNE, WHIN and MUDRI, with Deborah as manager. The collaboration has received state, national and international awards, and the GAD Pod team has developed a range of resources for the emergency management sector, including training, checklists, snapshots and postcards. Over to you, Deb.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Greg. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we all meet today. I'm on Djadja country, and pay my respects to Aboriginal people here today as well. So, since 2009, our gender and disaster research has been informed by hundreds of people. This presentation draws on the research to show that gender determines risk, experience and legacy in disaster and should be central to the way disasters are understood and managed. Through social construction of gender, women are made vulnerable, such as in the myth of women and children first, in the caring role assigned to women, lack of autonomy in decision-making, exclusion from hazard survival education, and in disasters' aftermath, through increased domestic violence. Men are also made vulnerable through the hero myth, risk-taking, overconfidence, loss of a sense of control, reluctance to seek help, and failure to live up to expectations of protector in the disaster and provider after. We will speak about people of diverse sexual and gender identities in Ada's April webinar, but this presentation is very much about the binary, as that's what is socially constructed and monitored, and that's the problem we're talking about today. We have worked to embed change, and through partnerships with the sector have had some success. Emergency management manuals now include information on gender, LGBTI people and DV, domestic violence. There's a DHHS policy on family violence in emergencies now, journal articles and national GEM guidelines. Registrations open today for the long-awaited follow-up to diversity in disaster our fourth conference, Gender Justice in Disaster, Inspiring Action. Our 2012 research, The Way He Tells It, was the first of its kind in Australia and found increased violence against women after Black Saturday. 17 of the 30 women in our study reported new or increased violence that they attributed to male partners' experience of Black Saturday. 7 remembered happy relationships disrupted by the fires. Our qualitative research finding was finally confirmed with quantitative data in 2019 with a study by Melbourne Uni showing 7-fold increases in DV in the worst fire-affected areas. This ADA webinar series is about recovery and how we engender resilience. The key is to hear when women speak of the violence against them. The silences on this after Black Saturday were deafening. This presentation will focus on the cultural context that supports violence against women in disasters, because this is what we can all change. Claire, Zara and I began this research by interviewing 47 recovery workers after Black Saturday. It was striking that so many questioned whether it was even appropriate to investigate women's experience of violence post-disaster at all. Some workers suggested removing the word violence from the recruitment flyer, and others warned that women will not respond. A year earlier, we sought ethics approval to interview police. And after a very lengthy period, we were advised that we could only do the research if we didn't talk about women and we didn't talk about violence. So in other words, we want you to shut up about it. Some workers vehemently rejected the notion this was a problem, and one worker after another spoke of heightened sensitivities. Many warned against adding to the burden on vulnerable communities. No data existed to identify and record incidents of DV, but women spoke to us about it. These are all false names. Haley said, when the fires started happening, he took the opportunity to try and get back into my life. Then a week after the fires, he was pushing and shoving me. He hit me and choked me. Ruby said, we'd separated a year before, but on the day of the fires, he mapped my way out. And at midnight, he turned up. A few months after the fires and after the death threats and after all the manipulation and intimidation, he pressured me by saying if I didn't give him the insurance money, he was going to take the children. Lauren said, he's like, you don't talk about it, you get on with your life, and you're weak if you need to see a counsellor. Leave me and you will be dead. These accounts are hard to hear at any time, but these women had their own experience of the catastrophic bushfires. Many spoke of putting aside their own breakdown until there was time for it. The imperative was to support their silently suffering and mostly absent husband and traumatised children. Even when men were all too present, seething and violent, many women spoke of them with compassion. Becky said, he was so intensely unsure who he was that any kind of criticism was amplified within himself. Men are constantly trying to surmount and be stronger and control. And when they face that fire, even the most beautiful guys, and I see some beautiful guys in the C of A, you see some of them crumbling. It just breaks my heart. It's not easy for men, facing as they do the unrealistic expectations of protecting family and community in catastrophic fires. Male privilege comes at a cost to men, as Steve will describe. In our interviews with 30 men after Black Saturday, all except one cried, some from start to end, and 3 spoke of suicide. For women, when it became unbearable and they sought help, with family they were ignored, accused of overreacting, and blamed for not caring well enough for their men. They were asked to stay by everyone, even by their children, because he was not himself, because he was a good bloke, because he'd suffered, because he was traumatised, because he'd fought the fires on the day, because he was a hero. because he was now unemployed, because they'd all been through so much, because of the traumatised community. They were asked to stay with dangerous men. Kylie said, he was on the edge and you could just feel it so many times. He took a knife and was threatening to kill us all. Jill said, I could see he was so angry, so angry. He pushed me into the ground, broke 4 ribs and the sternum. If he'd been drunk, I'd be dead. You just knew he was paying out on you, on everything. Courtney said, he's nearly 6'4" and he would tower over me and yell down at me like a lion. Every now and then, the kids would cop a slap over the face. The other day, he really lost it. It was the first time I thought, oh my God, is he going to? And Virginia said, he's punched me. Before the fires, it might have gotten bad once or twice a year, but never to that point. It felt really urgent that I had to get out. Some days I wondered if he was going to kill me. He made threats before. He said I had to get out because he felt himself like he was going to kill me, and he was warning me. I feel like I'm on borrowed time. This is deeply sad and unfair. The women who spoke to us had no one advocating for them. In one fire-affected town, a women's group meeting for support was told to disband. The women told of health professionals failing to follow up on initial conversations and willing to drop the issue if the man denied any violence or simply being passed on to inappropriate services. Some women were reprimanded by the person they confided in, and this effectively stopped them seeking support. Even trauma counsellors let women down. My private communication with a trauma counsellor reiterated that apparently respected men are not easily seen to be abusive. The counsellor described the woman as ending up with a broken arm and referred to the allegation of domestic violence. She wrote, others may think it's strange she and her colleagues responded in this way that they did, but she wrote, the man was horrified that his wife had a broken bone and he blamed himself. She wrote the context was one where people were acting out of character. Echoing this, case managers use euphemisms in their notes out of respect for the suffering man. Police were sensitive as well, often not following their own code of conduct. As one health professional said, there's lots of DV in Kinglake and the cops were saying they're not getting any reports. It was that enmeshment in community of they are the good guys who helped out with the fire. Another said, so much has been justified as a result of the fires. So much has been fobbed off. So many women have gone to police and been told by police things will settle down again. Even domestic violence services let women down. The response to our research from the only organisation that was funded to provide DV services was captured in a local newspaper. It read, the CEO said her service had not recorded an increase in DV after the fires, and she could not explain why the women had struggled to get help. She said the study would have attracted women who were aggrieved with the system and wanted to speak out. One of our participants responded. She said, she wrote in the paper, I agreed to take part in the study because I was seeing with my own eyes that not only had my partner become increasingly violent and agitated since Black Saturday, but friends' partners had as well. I sought help from the police and from the Family Violence Service in the months after the fires for domestic violence issues, and neither seemed to care less. Actually, they couldn't wait to try and pass me on elsewhere. After my experiences with the system, I felt humiliated and defeated. I now accept that this is my lot in life and that there is no one out there capable of helping me. As this was going to press, Claire and I were in the midst of presenting the findings in 3 events over 2 days in 2012. The first question every time was, but what about the men? At the Hidden Disaster Conference the next day, a senior woman in DV services said, this isn't real domestic violence. The man described was traumatised, a theme that continued for many years. Nobody wants to hear that men who embody the spirit of resilient and heroic Australia are violent towards their families. The silencing of women was necessary to protect this myth. When the stakes are high, it is men's interests that will be protected, and our commitment to the notion that women and children have the right to live free from violence is revealed as conditional. And the stakes are high when we speak of men who fight fires and men in respected positions. In Australia, anyone suggesting there could be problems within the cultures of firefighting is vilified. We saw it in 2019 in media leaping to the defence of firefighters when Sherelle Moody stated they could be perpetrators of DV. She received death threats. I appear in a Canadian YouTube video without my permission with the heading, "Feminists Slander Australian Firefighters and All Men." The GAD Pod was featured in Sky News a couple of times, and as expected, the tone was derisive. The influence of Sky News is strong and expanding. Beginning the 6th of January 2020, in the midst of the Black Summer fires, we worked hard and fast to ensure our training was available to volunteer and career firefighters. It was critical. They knew heroic masculinity was unrealistic. They had not failed to be the men they thought they were. Now, I'm not being sexist. The demands for heroic masculinity are directed to men. We wanted to disrupt the trajectory we knew too well from the research of suffering men and domestic violence. We wanted women, recovery workers, and communities to explicitly understand the ways women are co-opted into accepting violence from their partners after disasters, and to instead know that disaster is no excuse for family violence. We'd spent a decade speaking to women and men and offering highly evaluated training to disaster-affected communities, CFA brigades, Red Cross employees, local government. We were ready to go with training packages and trainers. This was the vision Claire, Rachel and I had in 2012 to train bushfire case managers to respond constructively to domestic violence for the benefit of women, men and children. Yet in 2020, month after month went by without funding. CFA and community groups in Malakuta and other fire-affected regions requested our training and had to pay fee for service. Thanks to the MFB's Mick Swift, Steve was able to offer GAD Pod training in his role as a firefighter with the Metro Fire Brigade, thereby halving the cost. In March, we moved to online training because of COVID, but it was still expensive. Respect Victoria were very supportive, commissioning training for primary prevention workers, but still no funding for response. After relentless lobbying and months of negotiation, we were paid to deliver free training to case support coordinators. Only 7 sessions on family violence after disaster were offered, and none about men in disasters. It was not funded despite very positive evaluations and despite requests for training. It's frustrating for us and for the people and organisations contacting us and unable to pay fee for service. On a very positive note, there's currently some interest from government in expanding the GAD Pod training nationally. The middle column on this slide portrays that the gendered impacts of bushfires and COVID are the same in almost every aspect. One of the few differences is that with coronavirus, there's a greater willingness to address the increase in DV because we're not talking about firefighters and pillars of the community being violent. Compare the media coverage. A Google search, hang on, I'll just get this up to date. A Google search of DV and Black Summer bushfires shows our research and not much else. And sadly, it shows this. Tragically, on May 12th, a woman's body was found at a home in Bendock, a remote town in East Gippsland, and a 64-year-old man was charged with her murder. Bendock was temporarily cut off and residents evacuated during January's bushfires. The increased risk of DV in disasters like bushfires remains under-investigated sociologically, not by police. In contrast, a Google search of DV and COVID is prolific. and we'll just see if this is going to work. So these are just a sample. You can do this test yourself by Googling, but heaps of these came up. So the pushback I've described in this presentation is what keeps violence against women at epidemic proportions. As Elizabeth Broderick and Elaine Ennison have both said, we don't need more research. We don't need more statistical evidence. We know what happens and we know why it happens. We just need to do things differently. But we don't. Instead, we tinker by offering a ubiquitous 1-800-RESPECT line, underfunded as it is, or we pathologise and medicate both women and men who rail against or cave in under the weight of unrealistic gendered expectations. Or we expand our concern to every possible marginalised group so the gender is barely visible. Diversity and inclusion replaced gender when the GAD task force was disbanded in 2015. Now, instead of constantly hearing, what about the men? I hear, it's not just about women, you know. No, it's not just about women, but it is about women and it is about girls. An adequate response to domestic violence in disaster recovery is the least we can do. So over to you, Steve.
Thanks very much, Deb, for your very insightful presentation, and also just acknowledging that this is a sensitive topic. So if anyone online experiences any issues with regard to what we're discussing today, we have put some numbers for the 1-800-RESPECT line into the chat box as well. So just to acknowledge that, Deb, and we'll talk more about that during the Q&A. I'd now like to introduce Steve O'Malley, AFSM, Firefighter Diversity and Inclusion with Fire Rescue Victoria. Steve is a leading firefighter and diversity inclusion officer with Fire Rescue Victoria. He has been an operational firefighter for more than 32 years and is a graduate in the study of human rights. Steve is a board and honorary life member of Women in Firefighting Australasia, or WAFA, a foundation member of the Emergency Management Victoria Gender and Disaster Task Force, and an FRV Family Violence Contact Officer. Steve is a long-standing presenter and advocate for prevention of violence against women and gender equity. Over to you, Steve. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Amanda, and thanks to everyone at ADA, Greg and Mel in the background there, for putting this together and inviting Deb and I to come and speak today. Look, it is a very heavy topic, and thanks for that trigger warning that you put into the chat there, Amanda, as well, or Greg. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which we meet as well, and I'm in Wurundjeri country, and I look over Birrarung here in Richmond, so very fortunate to have an outlook where I can, you know, be at peace with some of the nature around the place here. But once again, delving into this sort of topic is quite triggering and it can be quite distressing for some. I'd also like to acknowledge the victims and survivors of what we are talking about here today, which is domestic family violence and more specifically gendered violence, men's violence against women. They're the voices we need to hear the most. And I think Deb would agree that when she and Claire, and I'd also like to acknowledge the fact that Claire is no longer with us, and when I do this, I make a point of mentioning that she's a loss, and we do this in her memory as well. But the voices that they heard, the men and women voices that they heard, are the ones that inform this research. So it's really important that we utilise the voice of victims and survivors particularly when we're talking about this subject matter. Now, I don't have control of the slide, so we have no orderly way of moving on, but I'll just give a prompt as we go. Thanks, Gary. What I will do is I'll talk a little bit about the training in the end and some of the resources as well. But to kick this off, we need to talk about what the research has found. Now, unashamedly, Deb and Claire went in sponsored by or on auspice by the women's health service providers that were mentioned at the start. And this was using their feminist framework, that women's health, their modus operandi. Deb and Claire went into these communities to look at, unashamedly, as I said, the impacts on women through domestic violence post that disaster of Black Saturday. They found out really quickly that it was also about the men, because the men were overwhelmingly the perpetrators, and they were also victims of their own self-harm and suicide as well. What they found were that some pretty obvious points here, when we consider it's 11 years down the track now, that disaster impacts can be severe and long-lasting. But we're talking about, still talking about Black Saturday now, and Deb's longitudinal study goes back further into events in history that are also, ones that are etched in our memory. Men do talk about their disaster experiences if they're just asked. And that's the sort of theme that goes through a lot of the training, because we do engage men in the training and enlist their feedback and their voices in the training as well. But also men can be penalised for seeking psychological help, which is a bit of a theme. And I wonder, and keep on processing as we go through this, how far in your own knowledge and your own organisations we may have come since Black Saturday. Employment issues can be a major source of disruption. I'm talking about the volunteers in scenarios like Black Saturday, when they take themselves away from their home, their family quite often, their workplace, to go and fight fires, or to render assistance in another way. And maybe they could lose their place of employment. So employment is a huge thing, and whether or not they're included in the rebuild afterwards is another thing worth considering. Community aggression and male violence increases. That's violence in general. So, and that can be triggered by, but not caused by, the alcohol abuse, mental health issues, and suicide rates. So, and the rise in suicide rates, I should say. So that gender norms are more salient indicates basically that whatever the societal norm was, whatever was existing in that community at that time, will be basically elevated because of the circumstances. Thank you.
Hi, Steve. It's Greg in the background. We seem to have lost you. Sorry.
Oh. I'm still here. Can you hear me now, Greg?
Much better.
Okay, good. Sorry, I've got my door shut. Hopefully you can still hear. I can. Some people can hear. Thanks, Aaron. So if we can just move on to the next slide. So that's pretty much what they found, what Deb and Claire had found. It took them about a year or so to get into those communities, because we know what sort of trauma they would have been going through. So there was a lot of stewing in that time as well. And their work was definitely cut out for them, and they knew that as they were going in there. One of the gender schemas, or one of the thought processes we go through when we consider gender around disasters, and pretty much what this slide illustrates here, and it deals a lot. We deal a lot with this throughout the training, I should say. So it's the same old men in suits getting up talking about a disaster, and eventually they get to the fact that they can compare it to a war. So they can then push forward their heroes, and then they can speak in evocative terms that actually get people to sit up and listen. The press go out there and they invariably look for the sooty heroes, as it's mentioned there, and they look for the carers as well, the mums that are taking care of the kids back at home or in the safety of a relief centre or recovery centre somewhere. Next slide. Once again, a lot of this content is dealt with in the training, and we could talk forever. This image doesn't really need much explaining at all, except that this is the sort of thing that I act on. Just before Christmas, I think it was, I went to Kmart and I noticed they had swimming support buoyancy vests for boys and girls. And the boys one was a firefighter with, pecs and biceps and so forth. And the girls one was a princess. It took me about half an hour to change each of those princess ones onto the male cardboard cutout, and vice versa. Felt pretty vindicated in the end that Kmart may have gotten it wrong, so they can thank me later. But this is the sort of stuff that we see in advertising still. Next slide. And there's plenty of images like that. We see it all the time, and there's no secret that organisations could actually do better. If we could move on, please. Okay, so look, one of the outcomes and one of the epiphanies that I've had many throughout the course of this. I was at the first conference in 2012 where the Hidden Disasters research was launched, and to me it made me sit up. I'd been in the violence prevention field for about half a dozen years or so, and this, to put it in an emergency context, was absolute gold for me, because it vindicated a lot of what I was doing. And it was delving into that, one of the main determinants of violence against women, which is that adherence to strict gendered stereotypes. And going back to that last photo, that's the case in point. And given the fact that we're 96% men in operational capacities in fire services like ours, And that's pretty much an international standard. It goes up and down around a place, but that's pretty much the standard. So when it came time to join a working party, looking at the concepts of having gendered fire planning, it really did strike me that this was something new to me, because in the urban context, we didn't necessarily have a stay or go scenario. It was pretty much, if you have a fire in your house, get out, call 000, the firefighters will come. In this context here, the postcards that we've developed are looking at a gendered fire plan and a written fire plan. So actually, before summer comes along and the hot periods come, sit down with your family and discuss. If you have children, discuss with the children what the plan's going to be and commit it to paper as a pseudo contract of sorts, and put it somewhere where you can access it prior to the hot season, where you can look each other in the eye and say, this is the plan and the plan is the plan. And we don't go off on any other tangents, because no plan just isn't a plan at all. And you'll see, and throughout the course of the training, we look at, and I'll have a look at some quotes in here about what happens when there isn't a plan and the stresses that is put on men particularly. Next slide. The expectations of men, and these are, once again, when Deb and Claire asked them, this is what they actually said. And some of the comments, you know, I should give a bit of a swear warning here too, because there are a couple of only minor sort of swear words, but I will. Where Rod said that every man thinks that there are expectations of men to stand up and be brave and be the stalwarts of the family, and all those kind of somewhat Aussie ochre images. Instead, I think a lot of people were absolutely shit scared and didn't realise that that was perfectly natural and a normal feeling. But I'm sure those who were felt it was a weakness. So there was an acknowledgement that what they were feeling was absolutely acceptable and normal, but best internalise it, because if people see that you're feeling like that, it may be construed as a weakness. Much how tough, we can handle it. We look after the women folk. It's all bullshit, of course, said Todd. And this quote comes up a couple of times now, but it was Dr. Rob Gordon actually had this said to him by a particular client of his, where she said, I wanted a man who would protect me or die in the attempt, which is telling. Next slide. So there's expectations there that are just unrealistic. I mean, if that's the sort of comment that someone's going to come out with, well, then that's the agreement that they have in that household, obviously. What men said about their expectations after bushfire. So the expectations, okay, to get things back to normal, to make things better, to rebuild, and I think to appear effective. And Christ, the men really needed to appear as if they were effective, productive, constructive members of the community. Otherwise, they'd be judged accordingly. Why haven't you got it together? Why haven't you got your garden fixed? Why haven't you got your house done yet? What are you doing with your life? Why haven't you gone back to work? And why haven't you? It just continues. One person weighing up what another person isn't doing, therefore the stresses and the pressures that are put on men in those recovering areas just increases. Next slide. The media's a little bit to answer for. We all know that in any sort of circumstance, like the disasters of Black Summer, going Black to Black Saturday, it's really, this is we delve deeper into this sort of slide when we do our training, talking about the fact that community resilience or community-led resilience is a great concept, but community resilience in itself is quite flawed, because we can't expect people that are in a local area that's been obliterated to actually individually rebuild that area. They need government, they need the services, and they need the funding. So discussions about community resilience, and there was a great online discussion about this just recently, need to continue, because the community resilience we were talking about from Black Saturday has certainly moved. And I know that there are issues around how resilient the communities were around the Black Summer, and the fact that funds did take a while to come through, and it did polarise people a fair bit. Next slide. I hope my voice holds up, and I hope you can hear me okay. The fact that we toy with the concepts of emotion, anger is better than tears, comes up a fair bit throughout the course of Deb's work, and the fact that men were saying that they just couldn't show the emotion. There are good reasons for this. Our society monitors enactment of gender roles, and there are career penalties and loss of status for men who show emotion. I would beg to differ that people would assume Shane Fitzsimmons is a weak man because she showed emotion through the Black Summer, through 2020 and 2019. I think that showed absolute strength in the fact that he, who has absolutely the experience through losing his father through similar episodes, was able to get there and show emotion like he did. I think that's a tribute to a guy, a leader like him. I thought you were more of a man than that. So judging people, judging crew members or judging community members on the fact that they actually dare to show emotion. Researchers have drawn a direct link between men's perceived failure to live up to their own societal expectations and domestic violence. Well, we know that the societal expectations of men to be stoic and tough is something that feeds directly into the incidence of domestic violence, gendered violence. A third of the men in the research reported having to overcome personal barriers to seek help, having experienced stigma when trying to help, and having to overcome paperwork hurdles before being able to get help. Now, I know in an operational capacity, paperwork does people's heads in, particularly men. They just don't want to take the time to actually fill out the form to get a result. So they will just, circumvent that and not even go and get help. Next slide, please. Once again, keep in mind that one of the major recommendations from Royal Commissions into Black Saturday were about increasing mental health support for not just the operational people, but community members as well. And I think it's safe to say that that's pretty much the same as the recommendations or the funding that went into Black Summer. This is a slide where we sort of, we steel ourselves for a moment and we talk about emotions and we talk about in a room full of people, whether or not it is acceptable for men to show emotion, regardless of what they do for a living, regardless of what community they're from, regardless of what their sexual persuasion is, regardless of whether they're married or single or and regardless of their age. Go on to the next slide, please. An example of the difficulties is illustrated here, where this person, Luke, says that you make the big step to go into this store and speak to a GP about how you could may well be a fruitcake. And they say, just go next door. I walk into next door and it's a dentist clinic. So now she knows I'm a fruitcake as well because I've asked where the psychologist is. So then you go in and she says, I come back in 2 weeks when he finds the right place finally. Everyone else thinks I'm a fruitcake for 2 weeks and I've got to try to deal with it on my own for 2 weeks. You'd think, why did I even bother? One man who lives in a small, remote and rural community wasn't coping after the disaster. He worked in CFA doing road rescue as well as firefighting. It was important and called a confidential helpline to talk. About an hour later at midnight, a police officer knocked at his door and asked if he was okay. He said, I'm not going to do that again. So there's confidentiality issues, particularly in small communities. Next slide, please. And if they can't get what they want the first time, people will in general, they're likely to give up. Here we delve back into, have you seen a man cry at work? And we ask about how it actually made the person feel who was witnessing the emotion and how they actually interacted with that person at that time and then moving forward into their work relationship. Next slide, please. Career penalties are really salient to the volunteers who attend. And this is not just the fire services, but all the other volunteer services attend. In this context, it might sound like the volunteers, but whatever the case, people would be worried about the confidentiality, whether there was any feedback that came around the back saying, keep this guy away from big fires. He seems fragile. We don't want him on our crew. When the works coordinator was away, I used to get high duties, but I took that month off, which I took off as stress leave. Ever since then, there's been nothing. So because he showed vulnerability, because he showed in their eyes a weakness, he wasn't able to then get those acting up duties and high duties that he was used to getting. If I tell someone in the brigade that I'm feeling a certain way, they may likely take me off the rescue. So that holds me back. I mean, the rescue is a specialist appliance that people do specific training in, and to be punished because there might be a feeling that they would go to incidents that are traumatic is once again, a penalty of sorts. Next slide. Okay, so once again, we like to give accolades. We like to tell people that they've done great work. We do it, we share it with our families, we share it with our colleagues, we get up and we actually enjoy getting the gongs. If we could just move on to the next slide, and I'll move on a little bit just in case we do have some questions we can get to. Look, you know, Tim and Claire found that, and since subsequent to Black Saturday particularly, that the firefighters just don't want to be termed as heroes, because there's something inherently wrong with the term, with using the term hero, because it just puts pressure on people that, if in the case they did, in the eyes of the crew or the community, fail, well, then they have to cope with that. So this is an interesting article written by Leanne and Graham just last year, I think Black Summer, but a good colleague of mine, John Shawwell, who used to be in the CFA, or maybe still is in CFA as a volunteer, wrote an equally good article back in 2016. Move on to the next slide. We deal a little bit now with the hero myth. Firefighters don't want a roll call of heroes, but for communities to remember the lessons we have learned from past fires and to ensure they have a bushfire plan and to heed the warning to leave. Firefighters don't want us to see heroes, because calling them heroes overstates their ability to control what they do on the fire ground and to control how they actually act around fires, and downplays the long-term psychological impacts of fighting fires. You're not always going to be able to win, to have a successful outcome. Next slide. The recommendations from Debra and Claire's research look at addressing gender stereotypes, obviously. That feeds directly into that main determinant of gendered violence, or violence against women. So if we look at a gendered stereotype, and I know organisations worldwide are looking at this, you only have to look at social media to see the women in firefighting shared posts about how fierce they are and about how they're you know, resilient in the organisations they're in. So addressing those stereotypes are important, but particularly women in leadership roles, women in roles that are actually making decisions. And to dispel that hyper-masculine and the hero myth. It doesn't do anyone any good. Recognise and plan for the vulnerability of emergency services workers and first responders to ensure equal opportunities and respect to disaster survivors, not just the responders, but whole of community. Respect everyone that's going through the stresses that a disaster actually has in store for them or has left in their wake. Improve individual support for survivors' physical, mental and emotional health. Well, that is encapsulated within recommendations. To disentangle masculinity from firefighting. These are some of the ways that we can dispel that schema that gets set back about 50 years when the men in suits get up there and start talking about using that war narrative. So if we can disentangle the masculinity from firefighting, that's a good thing, because we know women are firefighters as well. We know that, you know, their peers respect what they do. So we shouldn't be just defaulting to the hyper-masculine aspect of firefighting all the time. Stop expecting men to protect the home and women to protect the children. Let men be vulnerable and ensure women and children's rights to live free from violence. It's unconditional. It's a basic human right to live free from violence, even after disaster. Next slide. You can dwell on these points after the presentation when you obviously download the recording, like we all will. This we're getting towards the end, which is great, but a couple of slides on the training, but this is just something that I use in presentations quite often. Teacher-led project where kids are sent away for paraphernalia. They come up with a male, female ambulance officer and a man and a woman as a police officer, but fire brigade, they can't even contemplate that there would be anything like a female firefighter, so they put a fire truck there instead. So one of the main outcomes from the work is the lessons in disaster training. You can go through these slides as you like. Thanks, Greg, now. So the aims of the lessons in disaster training are these, and these next slides sort of illustrate those aims as well. So we look at the evidence in session 1. We look at the research. We keep on coming back to the research. We look at the recommendations from the way that from the research, the interviews with the women, the quantitative stuff with the women, and then we look at what men said as well. Session 2, these are 90-minute sessions over a period of time, maybe 2 a day, and in the final 2 in a week or so. But we look at the gendered impacts and the impact of gendered expectations on men and women. In, you know, that iceberg scenario there is a metaphor that we use, and you would have seen that before, many of you. Session 3 is unpacked incredibly well by a colleague and associate at GAD Pod, Liam Leonard. Liam and I speak to gender, sexuality and sex, and it is, and every time I do this session, my mind boggles at just how narrow, you know, once my thinking was and how it broadens throughout the course of this presentation. Session 4 is when we talk about the takeaways from the training. We're not just doing it to get out of our core business as usual. We're doing this so we can walk away and get some tangible outcomes from what we've learned in the training and what we've delivered in the training. So develop strategies, support men's resilience, increase women's resilience, and challenge condoning of violence against women. So it's all that stuff. It feeds right back to where the original research was intended, which was the effects on women and the increase in family violence post a disaster, including the COVID context, which we haven't spoken about that much here. The guidelines was another amazing outcome. We are now at a stage where we want to investigate why the guidelines aren't utilised more by organisations. With the guidelines, and the final slide here looks at a checklist where organisations can, do their own checklist according to different topics within the guidelines. The Gender Equality Commissioner, Dr. Nikki Vincent, will be speaking at the conference at the Wheeler Centre, actually leading into the conference coming up. So this is a great opportunity for organisations to actually take some stock and do their own gender audit in emergency management, and to work out exactly what they've got to do and how they're going to do it, because it's really important, and now there's going to be some accountability. Thanks so much, Amanda.
Thanks very much, Steve. Great presentation. I've heard you present on this before, Steve, and always learn something new as well. And as someone who is involved in helping communities plan for bushfire preparedness, I too had an epiphany when I read some of the work of the GAD Pod about what a sort of a masculine lens we took to that, preparedness at a household level. So thank you for your work, and thank you also to Deb and the GAD Pod for all their work in this area. I'd also like to acknowledge that, it's been International Women's Day recently, and the theme for this year was Choose to Challenge. And I think that, we can all choose to challenge and call out gender bias and inequity in all facets, including disaster planning and preparedness, and through the recovery journey as well. So I will now go, we've had a few questions. We've got about 10 minutes, so keep those questions coming. You can also upvote questions as you see them currently appearing on the screen. But it would seem to me that, we've got 250 people online, and people are looking for sort of some practical support and guidance with this issue. So what is the one piece of advice you would offer to recovery workers and policymakers supporting communities experiencing family violence in recovery right now? I'll go to you, Deb.
Oh, well, it would be to actually be open to hearing what the experiences are of women and men and children affected by disasters, but also the first responders who are often drawn from the community. And it goes out from that. Also within emergency service organisations where there's, potential for constant trauma, we need to be able to listen. I'm going to preempt one of the questions. It said, how do we get men to recognise it's okay to go and get help? I don't think it is okay for men to go and get help, because they face career penalties. What I've picked up from firefighters is they love their job. And, people in the broader emergency management sector, like SES workers, AMBOs, they love their job and they don't want to risk it. So it's actually up to all of us to change and not say, you're a man. What's more, you're a certain kind of man who wears a uniform, and you need to behave in this way where you're, that ideal masculine macho man. We've got to stop doing that.
Thanks. And Steve?
Yeah, look, I think that our organisation has come ahead in leaps and bounds when it comes to discussing mental health and the issues that firefighters may have, and including our corporate staff as well. So PTSD issues, reaching out for help is encouraged and quite often communicated to right throughout the organisation. So I agree with what you're saying, Deb, absolutely. I still think that, given the way that men are and the fact that it is, they're going through with AFL footballers, and some of the AFL footballers that have committed suicide recently, they still have, that discourse is still current, and it's still relevant that men don't reach out for help. They'll act.
Thanks, Steve.
I was just going to say, my point is that often men, when they do reach out for help, wish they hadn't. That's why it's not actually up to them to do it, but it's up to the structures of emergency service organisations, the structures of every organisation, and our society to be more open to both not really strict gender stereotyped roles, and also open to thinking that mental health is not that much different to physical health in the broad scheme of things. So we need to not think, like I often thought, that quote about keep that guy away from the big trucks because he'd been to see a psychologist. What about the guys who were jumping onto that truck and hadn't had the insight to know that they needed help?
I'm going to move to a couple of, just in the interest of time, because we want to get through as many questions as we can. There's some practical questions about where people can access these workshops and training. So is that you, Steve? Would you like to talk to how people can access that training?
Yeah, well, I mean, the list of organisations that we've trained on behalf of, or we've trained their case managers and their frontline workers, the relief and recovery workers, it's a long list now, Deb, isn't it? So the training itself is that everything's accessible on the GAD Pod, which essentially is the portal from which you would either book training or access the research or access the other resources, the roadmaps resources that are in there. Deb?
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to say? That's pretty much it to access.
So should people contact the GAD Pod if they would like to find out about, okay, so we'll make sure that that link there is there on the post-webinar closeout with the webinar that we'll podcast and so on. Another more practical question, where can people find out more information about gendered fire planning? I've read your paper, it's excellent, but where do people find, practical assistance with that if they're working in the field?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because we've developed the postcards about fire planning with a gendered lens, and we've posed the questions and then the facts, what actually happens, what statistics tell us about, men trying to stay and protect the house and women trying to take the kids and go, We have thought for a while that we'd really like to develop a workshop around that. So that's in the pipeline, but in the meantime, we've got the postcards.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so there's a question here, and I'm going to try and sort of reword it slightly, but, there's a lot of emphasis on the impacts and rights of children and young people as the victims of male violence. But what about young people's experiences of family violence, which are often sort of minimised? What can we do for our young people to support them in a sort of a service response around violence?
Yeah, I'll just start by mentioning in our long-term disaster resilience, we had a focus group of about 6 or 8 young people, and they were 18. So they were thinking back to Black Saturday when they were about 8, 9, 10 years old. And they were still carrying the burden of that, and the burden of what happened, well, not only on the day in terms of can we just go rather than watching the fight between the parents, the mother wants to go, the father doesn't, socially constructed, and the kids are thinking, look, let's just go. In one particular case, this girl ended up in a CFA shed on the night of Black Saturday when people were coming in burnt, and you can just imagine the trauma that she's carried over all those years. So there's that aspect. There's also the aspect of family violence after the disasters, and of course kids are copying that too. We heard about one girl in the corner and her father was whipping her essentially. Also violence that's not so easy to see but is violence, where kids are forced to be parentified, and this is quite documented in the literature. So the parents aren't coping and the kids have to step up, look after the other kids, look after the farm. One particular boy working really long hours and really unable to attend to his schooling. Or of course the use of children to help protect homes when it's against the Charter of the Rights of the Child.
Thanks, Deb. Look, some of what you've mentioned will be actually presented in a future webinar. We are working with the Beyond Bushfires team at the University of Melbourne and Red Cross, who are going to present that 10 years of groundbreaking research that picks up on some of those issues you've just mentioned. And I'm looking to my team for the date of that. 30th of March. So we'll make sure information goes out on that, but some of what you've mentioned is covered off in that research as well. I think we've just got time for one more question. So Steve, given this for you, given that the MFB, now FRV, aims to improve community safety and resilience, and you highlighted that increasing resilience among women is one of the steps to assist in enabling them to avoid domestic violence and change the stereotypes, what is the strategy that Fire Rescue Victoria is employing? And maybe you can comment more broadly, because I know you're connected into other fire services as well nationally. So what is being done to help the workforce with these key issues?
Yeah, the research that VU were commissioned to do through the Bushfire Natural Hazard CRC is really important. The diversity and inclusion research, I think, is really important. And there's going to be a roadshow where the organisations are inviting the researchers in to talk about, what's promising practice, what looks like best practice out there. I think FRV are using this opportunity as a new organisation, say, to draw a line under what has happened previously and to restart and reboot. I mean, government have said they need more women in the organisation, more operational women. I've got my own opinions about that, in that, just by virtue of having parity doesn't necessarily mean the workplace culture is going to change. And ambulance, as much as I love the ambulance service, absolutely, they found that they had issues and they've got better than parity in their operational crews. So once upon a time, I would say emergency medical response is one of our main core businesses. Why don't we pitch it the way that ambulance do? But that's not, just by getting them through the door isn't enough. You need the culture in place that's actually going to support them and retain them. When I say them.
Thanks, Steve. Look, I'm going to have to call the Q&A session to a close only because we're allowed now for the webinar. I think we could probably keep you both on all day answering questions. So if people have follow-up questions and send them in to our events team, we can make sure they get to you, Steve, and you, Deb, to be answered. But look, I'd like to thank you both very much today for sharing your knowledge and your deeply held understanding based on research and evidence of these very important topics that do challenge us to talk about but must be talked about, and given a lot of space for us to consider these issues, particularly as we go through the recovery process with communities. I'd also like to say that AIDA is proud to recognise GAD Pod as a winner of the Resilient Australia Awards in 2019. GAD Pod received special recognition as a project of national significance for their initiative addressing domestic violence in disasters through implementing national gender and emergency management guidelines. And just a bit of a plug, most of you know, I would think that AIDA hosts and manages the Resilient Australia Awards program on behalf of the Commonwealth Government, and the submissions for that have just opened. So our team will be putting up a slide on that and a link to that in case you would like to consider your project that you're working on for presentation. So again, thank you to Deb, thank you to Steve for making time to speak with us today. As mentioned earlier by Steve, AIDA will be hosting another webinar with GAD Pod, and our events team will send out information on that in the coming weeks. We are also hosting the Recovery Matters webinar with the Red Cross that I mentioned, and that's on the 10 years of beyond bushfires research coming out of Melbourne University. So that is also one not to be missed. On behalf of AIDA, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. We will send you an email once the recording from today's session is live on the Knowledge Hub for you to share amongst your colleagues. And when you exit today's Zoom session, we will send you a link to a short survey, and we would really appreciate some feedback on today's webinar and any future topics you would like us to consider. It's been a pleasure to host you this afternoon. Until next time, stay safe and farewell. Thank you.